So I'm in Eaton Rapids, Michigan today at the Rosehill Cemetery, and they are about to start a cemetery tour that has been put on and organized by the Eaton County Historical Commission. So this should be a lot of fun. These folks do a great job on these cemetery tours, spend a lot of time researching it and preparing these events, and they invited me specifically to film today, so gonna have a lot of fun. Come along and join me.
Hey, welcome to our Rosehill Cemetery Tour. This is sponsored by the Eaton County Historical Commission. I'm really thrilled to see all these people. We've been trying for several years to get a cemetery tour here and had troubles doing that, but now we got it and we almost had to cancel today too. The Historical Commission is a commission appointed by the county commissioners, and we mostly fundraise, and then with that money we fundraise, we give away to organizations that preserve history. We also give an annual Heritage Award to people who are going above and beyond in working in history. And we just like to have fun too. We do books and we do tours and raffles and stuff like that. So anyways, the cemetery. Rosehill was established around 1874, but it wasn't the very first cemetery in Eaton Rapids. There was another one down by the old athletic field, if you all know where that is. And but they decided it was too close to downtown, and it was a floodplain. It's right next to the river. So they decided in 1874 to move it here. So, and the other side is the older part of the cemetery where most of those people were buried. This is the newer side. The thing about the move is that the families were responsible for moving their own family member. And so according to Scott Munn, who wrote The Only Eaton Rapids on Earth, which he's got right here, a copy of, the boys playing later, like next year, year after, would occasionally find random bits and pieces in that field out there. So, but you can look at City Hall. They have the old record books, and it shows when everybody was moved. But a lot of them were probably not much left, to move, and some of them might be buried together in a group. The mausoleum, which you can see straight ahead, was built in 1920 by a private company. They sold plots or lots, whatever you want to call it, in there, and they built it to the number of lots sold. So if they had, 100 people, they made it for 100. They didn't make it 150 or 120. They just built it to demand. And it has an identical twin, looks just like it, maybe a little bit shorter, in Auburn, Indiana. But theirs is much better maintained. This one just lost most of its stained glass inside. Theirs, they have like little string quartets, and they have fundraising cocktail parties and stuff, and then that goes towards the preservation of the building, and theirs has also been made a historic site. And there used to be a road in between to the Hamlin Township Cemetery, the Oakwood Cemetery, which it was originally known as King Cemetery because it was on the land of Rufus King. And that path between has since been closed. And many of the early settlers of this area are buried in Oakwood also. Okay, so we're going to start the actual tour. We'll go this way. My very first cemetery tour I went on, I was hesitant to step on the graves, and it depends on what you believe, but the lady there who was leading it told me, well, if you walk on their graves, it lets them know somebody's visited them, or at least been in the area. So take it or leave it, but that's so you don't feel so guilty. Okay, I'm going to talk about Herman Van Ark. Here's his photo, this gravestone. He was in World War II. So military heroes came from and returned to Eaton Rapids after their tour of duty, like Herman Van Ark, also known as Captain Van Ark or Dr. Van Ark. He was in the U.S. Army, World War II. 30-year-old Van Ark was part of the 117th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron and was sent to a combat unit at the French village of Montreval. On September 2nd, 1944, the Germans launched a strong counterattack against the American defenders of the town. The Germans thought they were battling what must have been a full division of U.S. troops based on the intense fighting, but in reality there were only about 150 American soldiers. Van Ark set up a medical post in the Montreval Town Hall. The medical detachment, which included Mr. Van Ark and Private Walter Cassina, were treating American soldiers and the Germans. Cassina was injured by shrapnel and lost an eye, and Van Ark was also wounded, but they both continued treating casualties. The Germans attacked the town hall where they were set up with a tank, forcing the Americans to surrender. An 11-hour battle was over. Montreval was now in the hands of the Germans. The German commander came to see the Americans who gave them so much trouble. He was surprised that it was only a small troop. He noticed that the American medical team continued to provide care to both the Americans and the Germans, and because of this action by Van Ark's crew, no American medics were taken prisoner. 6 Americans were killed in the battle and more than 80 Germans. Later, Van Ark was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the American Campaign Medal, the European, African, Middle Eastern Campaign Medal, a Purple Heart, and the World War II Victory Medal for his service. This summer, France, or people in France, is preparing the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Montreval in September. Dr. Van Ark will be honored there with a special display and a road named after him. His family was not aware of the total of his military experience until they received news from the French organizers of the event. Most of his military records were destroyed in the fire in 1973, and he didn't share much about the war. He merely returned to Eaton Rapids to continue his medical practice. After returning from the war, Van Ark moved to Eaton Rapids. In 1947, he, along with Dr. Albert Meinke and his uncle, Dr. Bert Van Ark, formed a nonprofit corporation known as the Stimson Medical Group and established their own private practice at the old Stimson Hospital. It worked out well for all involved, sharing resources, and with the hospital right there also. Shortly after they had everything set up for the practice, the Stimson Hospital was condemned by the fire marshal. The building needed about $40,000 in repairs to bring it up to code again, which none of the doctors could afford. A new hospital was needed, the community decided, and fundraising began. Land was donated by G. Elmer MacArthur for the building. Groundbreaking began in 1955, and the Eaton Rapids Community Hospital opened in 1957 at the corner of Main and Spicerville. The town people held a parade from the old hospital to the new hospital. The same group of doctors also established the Eaton Rapids Medical Clinic, which was located across Spicerville from the hospital. Dr. Van Ark died while he was still in practice. He died suddenly while mowing his lawn on a riding lawnmower. So anyways, that's the story of Dr. Van Ark.
Hey everybody. I have the honor of presenting about Ward Burleson and his wife Helen today. I'm dressed as Helen. She was always known to wear nylon. She always wore a dress. She didn't like to wear pants, and she always wore an apron too.
And who are you?
I'm Mary Burleson. I'm the great-granddaughter of Ward and Helen. Ward Beecher Burleson was born in Hamlin Township on July 21st, 1898, to Hattie Dickinson and Elihu Burleson, the youngest of 7 children. When he was just 3 years old in 1901, his parents divorced. Not really heard of a whole lot back then. His father, Elihu, drank a lot, which resulted in him spending some time in an asylum. His mother remarried William Stetson in 1903, but he unfortunately died just a few short years later. And in 1910, his mother remarried again to Dr. George Benjamin Snyder, a local optometrist. After such tough times in his childhood, Dr. Snyder changed his and his siblings' lives by raising them as his own and was very kind to them. Ward quit school in the 7th grade and worked for a time at Horner Mill during his teens. He had a playful sense of humor, which can still be seen today in a picture found at the Miller Farm ice cream parlor just down the road. There's a picture of the Horner workers hanging there, and young Ward can be seen on both ends of the picture. The number of workers was so large that they had to take 2 separate pictures, and he thought it'd be really funny to run down on the other side and be at both ends. So. Ward soon found his life's work and passion when he trained with the DeCourcy Monument Company, which later became the Carr Monument Company. He learned about stone cutting there and the tools of the trade. During this time, while living in Charlotte, he met Helen Hall through some mutual friends, and they were married on October 10th, 1923. Helen was born in 1904. She was the daughter of Clyde Hall and Laura Brundage, who are both buried here, and had 2 younger brothers. Her family had been in the lumber industry near the town of Lake, Michigan, but moved to Eaton County to seek a better job with the Horner Mill. And her brother, Harvey, actually worked with the Miller Farm, too. Ward and Helen had 3 children, daughter Naomi, in 1925. She's actually back there. Daughter Martha in 1927. And son Clyde, who's back here, was born in 1933. That's my grandfather. In 1927, Ward's beloved stepfather passed away. He had owned an actual huge portion of land here in Eaton Rapids at the edge of town, not far from where we stand today. In his will, he left much of the property to Ward, but this presented an opportunity, and Ward sold some of the property in order to finance opening his own monument business. The Burleson Monument Works was located near where Eaton Rapids Senior Center stands today, and they lived in a house next door, which is now, I think, a parking lot. Grave markers in those times were often made of marble and granite. Ward drew the designs freehand, so he was kind of an artist. They would first put a material on the stone, which he could draw the design, and then he would use a sandblaster to cut into the stone. Because businesses in those days used freehand to create the designs for the stones, their styles are recognizable. So if you ever walk through cemeteries, pay attention to some of the older stones, check out their style, and you might see some similarities between the stones. Ward's family, even today, is able to walk through cemeteries and recognize his personal style, and this is actually one that he did. Ward carved many grave markers that can be seen in cemeteries all over Eaton Rapids, Charlotte, Mason, Holt, Springport, and even Lansing. He didn't just make grave markers, though. He also created some cement urns for the cemeteries. Helen would do a lot of that work, actually, for him, which is kind of cool. He also created some notable sites around town. If you go to the Island Park, you can see a memorial to the firefighters, which is a big bell right as you walk through the park. And on it, you can actually see his initials, WB. That was kind of a joke because he wanted some credit and the town wouldn't get it to him. So he was cheeky and carved the name, his initials on the bell.
I thought it was William Brainerd.
Yeah. He also helped to carve the stones and the plaque for the drinking fountain on Main Street, which is found right next to Red Ribbon Hall. Owning a business back then could be tough, and in December of one year, the monument works burned to the ground. Much of their valuable tools and equipment were lost. However, their house was saved with the help of the Eaton Rapids Fire Department, who, using their newly acquired gas masks, were able to enter through the heavy smoke and save the house. He did rebuild, and that building, again, still stands today, which is the Senior Center now. And that's an older picture of what that looks like. Dad actually found that for me, which is pretty awesome. Carving stones was pretty dangerous work. The protective gear used today in the trade didn't exist back then. So Ward wore a canvas hood and an eye shield, but the hood didn't have ventilation, so his lungs actually took in all of that sandblasting. He became very ill due to lung disease in the late 50s and was hospitalized a few times in 57, 58. While his wife Helen, his son Clyde, and his son-in-law George Whitehead tried to continue the business, it was too much for them to handle. Helen was getting older, and Clyde worked for General Motors and was married with 2 young children. So later that year, they sold the business to Ed and Zig Brzezicki. Ed had worked for several years at the Car Monument Company, so knew the trade. And the name of the Burleson Monument Works was changed to the Eaton Monument Company, which Ed and Zig's family ran for years and still exists today in Charlotte out on Battle Creek Road. On March 24th, 1958, Ward passed away. His lungs literally had disintegrated from the years of exposure to sandblasting the monuments. He was just 59 years old. He was a well-beloved member of the community and remembered as a kind and giving person. If someone couldn't pay money for a stone, he would accept items in exchange. He even did some monuments for free, particularly for children whose families weren't able to pay. A Lois Miller wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper about what an extraordinary man he was, and that as long as his mother lived, Ward made it a point to go see her every single day, even if it was just for a few minutes. Though he was a quiet person, his family remembers him as having a playful sense of humor. He loved to watch The Three Stooges and The Lone Ranger, and he'd also joke about having to walk all the way to work when he lived just next door. He had a soft spot for his children and grandchildren who would often play amongst the grave markers at the shop and sneak into his workshop to watch him work. It's pretty amazing that despite many rough times in his childhood and only being educated through the 7th grade, he established and ran a successful business for over 20 years, which still exists today, although it's under a different name now. And as you walk through the cemetery today, see if you can spot his signature style. And if you get a chance to go to Island Park, check out that bell, because that's something that's always kind of fun, and his cheeky sense of humor. So there's a couple pictures of him. That's one when he was younger, and we think that is Mr. DeCourcy with him, and that's him and his wife Helen when he was a little bit older. And one more funny story is he actually had picked out a stone. It was like gorgeous. He designed the monument, which is really cool. And then at the end, like, he couldn't afford it. So, you know, didn't make a whole lot of money back then, but that was still a very nice one.
I'm here to tell you about Liberty Bell Hicks. I found out that he was a descendant of mine, and an ancestor of mine, and I had the privilege of knowing his two great-great-granddaughters that lived in Concord, right in my neighborhood, and it gave me an inspiration to look more into his history, because she always told me that they were related to us, and so we're still trying to make that link. Liberty Bell Hicks was born in Ohio in 1839 to William and Sophia Hicks. And in Maryland, where the family originated from, the family had packed up their belongings in an ox cart and started over the mountains, heading for Michigan. It was rough traveling, and when they arrived in Wheeling, West Virginia, they stopped just for the night. A brief layover turned into several months, as Liberty's father was hired to drive a stagecoach till spring rather than continue the journey during the harsh winter. In April, they packed up and continued on the journey west, arriving in Ohio. Liberty's father was again offered a business proposition. A local potter was short-handed, and being unskilled at any profession, Mr. Hicks saw this as a way to learn a trade to enhance his opportunities for when they arrived in Michigan. Hicks's father became quite proficient at pottery and was made superintendent, which prompted him to stay for several years. Short trip, right? Liberty and his brother apprenticed to a mason so that they could help their father building a pottery business in Michigan. Liberty became an expert at using a stone hammer and could break a boulder to any size and shape. The family saved up to buy the team of horses and a wagon and started on the last leg of their journey to Michigan, arriving in Eaton Rapids in 1857. They immediately started looking for the spot with the best grade of clay for their business, which turned out to be out on M99 past Petриeville. They built a log cabin where they manufactured jugs, crocks, and dishes for table use. One of the boys helped their father make the pottery, while the other peddled the wares by horse and cart in town. They worked at this until the Civil War began, when both Liberty and his brother enlisted. Without his son's help, and because he was unable to find any other competent help, their father had to close their pottery plant. Liberty enlisted into the Union Army during the Civil War and was part of Company G, the Michigan 13th Infantry Regiment. As a boy, he had been a baker's helper and became quite proficient at that, so when he needed to list his profession for the military, he put baker and was assigned to the commissary. But one day, the drummer boy was wounded in battle, and as Liberty had been a member of the Drum and Fife Corps in Ohio, he willingly stepped into the role. He seized the drum, did his part in inspiring his comrades to carry Old Glory into victory. Liberty was honorably discharged in 1865 and returned to this area and married Georgina Sabin, and they had 9 children: Amy, Jacob, William, Eva, Addie, Idabel, Benjamin, and Hazel Pearl. And Hazel is buried here. She died of rectal cancer at the age of 31. Back in those days, that was unheard of. Liberty built a bakery in Eaton Rapids and planned to start a wholesale business, but fire destroyed the plant. The village of Eaton Rapids was growing rapidly, and Liberty saw a future in masonry, so he took that as his life's work. He also taught his sons William and Benjamin the art of masonry, and they followed in his footsteps. For many years, he worked as a stonemason in the Eaton Rapids area. Some of you may remember his house out on Michigan Road. The house is no longer there, but it was a house made entirely of fieldstones, including a round stone fire chimney. He placed a cornerstone in the house marked with his name and the date. He was very proud of his work, especially seeing as he was 75 when he built it in 1914. Liberty Hicks passed away in 1921.
So welcome everybody. My name is Pam Colstock and I'm the mayor for the city of Eaton Rapids, and I think Deb thought it would be appropriate to have a current mayor talk about a former mayor. And so we are going to talk today about Barzilla. That is really truly his first name, Barzilla Hoyt Custer. I know, he went by BH, so I can kind of understand why he would do that, having Barzilla as a name. Barzilla Hoyt Custer, also called BH, was born in West Virginia in 1877, the youngest child of Oliver and Ann Custer. He married Hannah Shelton in 1881, and they had one son who passed away shortly after birth. Hannah passed away as well just a year later after that. Barzilla then married Laura Rogers, and they had two children, Maddie and Henry. Not really sure why or how they ended up moving to Eaton Rapids, or how he ended up moving to Eaton Rapids. But his son Henry, I'm sure a lot of you that have been around Eaton Rapids for a long time will remember a gas station called Foot and Custer. That was owned and partially owned and operated by his son Henry. Henry inherited the entrepreneur gene from his father, as Barzilla had a few businesses in Eaton Rapids: Custer and Norton's, Custer and Rogers, and the Right Place. In 1908 and in 1909, Custer served as mayor, replacing Mayor Charles S. Horner. As mayor, Custer took it upon himself to rid the town of their drinking problems. Imagine that in Eaton Rapids. He resolved to cure the town of this problem by posting a list of the 30 most prominent drinkers in 5 saloons that we had here in Eaton Rapids, warning of the sale of liquor to them. He also ordered all slot machines to be removed from saloons. He posted the following message to the saloon keepers of Eaton Rapids: "You are hereby notified to close your place of business promptly at the hour designated, and all inside screen doors and windows to be open, all curtains at both windows drawn, and all obstructions to view removed according to law. When your place of business is closed Saturday night, it must remain closed until the hour on Monday morning." He went on to say he did not have any ill feelings towards the saloon owners, but he wished to protect them as well as all residents. I'm thinking this might be why he served a very short time as mayor. It's just a guess. Don't really know for sure.
His business is any either.
Yeah, right. Custer also served as a city commissioner and a city supervisor. During World War I, Custer resigned as city commissioner to work in a munitions factory in Jackson, Michigan. He felt at that time that that's where he could best serve the public, is by doing that. He passed away in 1922, and all businesses in the downtown closed for 1 hour during the funeral, and it was known to be one of the largest the city had ever seen. When he lived in Eaton Rapids, he lived at 106 King Street, where his son Henry also lived out his days. His son Henry and grandson Jack Custer are both buried here. I think Jack is over here. Or I'm sorry, Henry. Henry also served in World War I, and Jack also served in World War II. Who's this one?
Yeah, that's Henry.
This is the son Henry?
No, it's gotta be his brother.
No,
I
this
don't know.
is 1940. It could be. He did have. Well, he only had 2 children, Henry and Maddie. So this could be some of their extended family as well. So, and that's all I have.
Born Anderson Scott Woodfin and was born a slave in Virginia. He was sold for $1,400 and moved to Alabama, then to Mississippi, and then to Arkansas with his owner. During one of his many escape attempts, he was captured by Union soldiers and ended up being trained by the Union Army. He worked at Fort Pillow in Tennessee and in Helena, Mississippi. Headed north after the war and ended up in Lorain, Ohio. came to Eaton Rapids in 1870 with a local businessman named Porter Knowles, who owned a motel called the Knowles Motel. I assume it was downtown. Lived at 507 Canal Street, which is right 2 or 3 doors down from the corner on Canal Street. Went partially blind a year before his death, and completely blind the last few weeks before his death on May 15th, 1880. He lived with Nat Davis, who was a member of the Grand Army Republic post here in Eaton Rapids. Nat's grave is here. Major Woodfin does not have a stone here. The funeral, I guess, was something to be seen. The expenses, he was so fondly thought of, the expenses were taken on by the local businessmen. And it was so well attended, there was standing room only. And one of the last things he was known to have said was 70 years a slave, but died a free man. That's all I have for you.
Is he not buried here then?
Yes, he is, but he has no marker.
Do you know where it is?
Right, he's buried with Nat Davis.
Okay.
That's according to Scott Munn's book. That's where he's buried, but he doesn't have a marker. So if it hadn't been for the research of these people, we'd never know he was here. You know.
What a wonderful crowd today. Thank you for coming and visiting us. You caught me editing a book. You know, my name is Rhea. I'm Rhea Miller, the daughter of Dennis and Minnie. But let me tell you first about my grandparents. They first came from New York back in the 1800s, 1872, that they came to this area here. Prior to that, they were living in Lansing, where now the Mount Hope Cemetery is, and that was their farm. But Grandpa John was worried that there were too many people moving in on him. Oh my gosh, we've got a neighbor at least a mile away. Oh, that's too close. And the city was toying with the idea of having a cemetery, so they kind of enhanced that idea, and they bought the property from them, and they came out here to Eaton Rapids and had a piece of property there. I'm talking about John and Rebecca. John and Rebecca are my grandparents, and they were part of the development of the area. There was several children. We have some infants here on this permanent marker. Here we have some identifications of different levels. But John and Rebecca were just wonderful people. Now John died in 1882, it was, and he had 2 children. There were 4, it looks like, from the looks of the grave markers. There's 2 infants, and then there are Dennis, would be my dad, and Arabelle. We know very little about my Aunt Maribel, my good Arabelle, because although she lived to be 63 years old, there's almost no record of her other than a marker here in her existence. We do know she attended high school here in Eaton Rapids. We understand she married, and inherited a little bit of the property, but then after that she just kind of disappeared. So that's kind of a ongoing investigation that I'm going to make sure I do. I'm 100 years old already, so what do I know? I'm already editing my book of my life, and it'll go on. Now, Arabelle, as I said, she lived to be 63 with no identification. But my dad, Dennis, who's over here, and my mom, when he was a child, his father died when he was only 13 years old. So John died, Dennis inherited the responsibility. And, excuse me. And so he, at 13 years old, was the man of the house, and he had to take over that farm. We had a very small little house. In the meantime, in 1864, there was a gentleman building a house right next door. And so eventually, when that gentleman passed away, Mom and Dad, Dennis and Minnie, had been married for a bit, and they bought that house and they moved into it. Grandma was still around and kind of lived in with them, but they lived in the house that's now on State Street where the farm is. They started out with a very small barn and cattle. And Dad loved Holstein. So that because he felt the cream and all was the best. But they were selling milk for only 2 cents a quart. And Mom, Minnie, she said, oh, there's got to be a better way out of this. But in the meantime, she liked to socialize, and she was making churned ice cream. A hand crank on the kitchen table, all right? So she went forward and said, her friends said, this is quite good. Could you make me some? Well, yes, of course. And so they started cranking out ice cream, and by 1896, they were responsible for supposedly about 196 gallons of ice cream that they cranked on their house. And in order to keep it cold, they had to keep getting ice, which they cut off the river, and they had a big ice house, and they'd chip it and make it happen with the aid of salt, as we may or may not know. You would grind, you'd chip the ice, put the salt on it, but their formula was extra good because it was almost a custard. We've lost track of that recipe, by the way. If anybody knows where we can find it, we'd like to try that ice cream. And I'd put any of you to work cranking ice cream. So anyway, Dad died in 853, and Mom, Minnie, she was a Fowler, by the way, if that means anything for family names. But Mom died in 1940, but Dad, Dennis, he went on to continue with the business. Now, in the meantime, they also had children. I'm one of them. I'm Rhea. And like I said, I've lived to 100 years old. I'm almost there myself, but anyway. Charles was born in 1901. He was a brother. He died in 1946 in a plane mishap because this Miller clan had become very popular. The ice cream business was growing. They had outside vendors that they sold to. They had ice cream parlors around. He had been in the service. He flew planes. At one mishap coming into our airport, where they put a soccer field that used to be an airport there. And coming in, apparently there was some mishap, and I believe he went off the runway anyway. He crashed and died. Okay, so that was in 1946. There was also George. George was born in 1896 and died in 1979. And he and I, after the passing of our parents, inherited the house. So myself and George wanted to do some entertaining because we enjoyed the company of all the extra people in town. So we did some remodeling at the house there on State Street, and we had a wonderful opening, and we did some interior redoing. And so we had, in 1955, we had a grand opening of our brand new remodeled house. In the meantime, Charles, who had been killed in the plane crash, he did have a couple of children. They were adopted. By the way, the Millers themselves had no biological descendants. So that's why the property or the business was eventually sold, and it was sold to a company up in the Thumb area, and they did produce ice cream here at the Miller farm until about almost the middle 1980s, and then they relocated back. But we had back to the son of Charles. His name was Chumley, and he was unfortunately died as the result at only 6 years old with a misused bat at a ball game. there in the schoolyard, and it hit him in the head, and he only lived just a short time after that. So as I complete my book, I'm going to be able to add all of these good things, and someday maybe you'll be able to read something good about it. But I'm glad you came today, and whatever we can tell you about this wonderful family, be sure to think about it and ask questions. I'll be around. I'm only 100, I'll be around for a while. Thanks so much for coming.
Okay, well, hello. I am really pleased to be able to tell you today about the Samuel Horner family. And of course, this includes the Horner's Woolen Mill, which is those mammoth buildings that you can't miss as you enter from the north and the west side of Eaton Rapids. And the smokestack, I hear, has been in the news quite a bit here lately.
The whole place.
Yeah. And so today I am posing as Innes Iris Horner, and I am the last descendant of Samuel and Elizabeth went by Innes Horner. I am the last descendant to bear the name of Horner. I'm the only child and did not have children. But my life was full as I graduated from Albion College and went on to own a gift shop in the Palmer House in Chicago. When my mother fell ill, however, my family needed me, and I came back to Eaton Rapids when I was in my mid-30s. I didn't end up working for the woolen mill, but found a rewarding career as a bookkeeper and secretary for George Miller at the Miller Dairy Farm. And if you love what you if you love what you do, you work until you're 80, like I did. So I'm very proud of what my grandparents started, and then my Aunt Janet, Uncle Charles, Uncle Edward, and my father William, who's buried right here. Here's my father's grave and here's my mother's grave, and behind you would be Innes's, who I am, is grave. So there are Horners all around here. It was a fairly large family, but there are no Horner descendants left. So I'm very proud of how they managed to develop that mill. Grandpa had a humble beginning in Yorkshire, England, and Grandpa there in England worked as a mill worker. So, that's, not real high wages or anything. And I think I read at that time that they had kind of, it was poverty in England at that time. And so he immigrated to the United States. And when he came here, he found work as a mill worker in Massachusetts. Grandma also was a mill worker in Massachusetts, and that's where they met and married in 1855. Grandma, however, Innes, she was a little bit more skilled. She was a paisley shawl weaver. And a paisley shawl, we know what paisley is. Chris Larson has paisley on. But in those days, the paisley would have been two-toned, two colors. But the weaving was very difficult because most weaving, is straight lines, as in this plaid. But when they got to paisley, and it was quite popular during the 1850s to the 1860s because one of the queens had worn it, and so everybody wanted it. And then it lost favor. But it's also named, the Paisley name comes from the city in Scotland where the woolen mill and the whole shebang started. So that's where they get the name Paisley, for the paisley weaving. Grandpa Samuel and Grandma Elizabeth Innes were married in 1855 in Massachusetts. In their young married life, they tried out Kansas, Missouri, and Ohio. Meanwhile, their children were being born, Jenny, Charles, Edward, and my father William. And finally, in 1880, they purchased the Gallery Woolen Mill here in Eaton Rapids, and they stayed put. The mill they purchased at that time, the only thing they had was a carding machine. And a carding machine is what takes the washed wool and sort of straightens it out and cleans it up a little bit. So women in those days would have been thrilled to have wool carded for them, and you've probably seen this, right? These are hand cards. But before being able to go to the Gallery Woolen Mill to get carded wool, they would have had to done this all by hand. And it's very time consuming and very monotonous. So, so that mill provided that service for pioneer women. Therefore, they were able to make more hats and mittens and warm clothing for their families. So it improved the standard of living a lot. Let's see. The entire family worked in the mill. Aunt Jenny took care of the record books, and those record books are still archived in the Michigan State University archives. So that's where some of these numbers come from that you will hear later on. 3 years after purchasing the mill, the family took the risk of investing in modern carding, spinning, weaving, and finishing machinery. It took a lot of skill and hard work to become acquainted with this machinery. So it was a full 2 years before they were able to actually produce their first length of fabric and blankets. But they were on target with their business because only 2 years after that, they signed a huge contract for uniform fabric with the vocational school in Lansing. So I don't know anything about the vocational school, but that must have been a big deal. My aunts and uncles were not college educated, but they learned by doing, and they studied technical or mechanical journals for their ultimate success. Each sibling played a role in the mill operation and sometimes outside of the mill. Uncle Charles was really the mechanical genius of the family. He figured out the machinery and improved upon the original designs. My father, Will, was the supervisor of the mill. So farmers from surrounding counties made a day of delivering their wool to Eaton Rapids and either selling it or returning it for batting or ready-made items. My father had to assess the wool for quality as it came into the mill. And this is really important because all wool is not created equal. You know, just like dog hair, when you look at dog hair, it all is different on different dogs. So he had to grade that wool and put it into a different category for whatever use it might be the best for. And he was well known in this area as a wool grader, which right now, you know, we don't think much of, but in that time that was a really important thing. Uncle Edward was brilliant about the new technology of electricity. He was contracted to install the electrical lines that powered the first streetcar in Grand Rapids and Elkhart, Indiana. In 1888, the Progressive Horners installed a dynamo and gained a contract to provide light to the city of Eaton Rapids. That's pretty cool. In 1900, ground was broken for a new and expansive mill that you see the remains of today. Through the family's consistent efforts, excellent management, my father, and the superior quality of their merchandise, they made their company one of the leading woolen mills in the United States. In 1918, the family business was incorporated as Eaton Rapid Woolen Mill, and then 20 years later, it was renamed as Horner Woolen Mills Company. The mill produced yarns of various types up until World War I, after which knitting machines were installed to produce the fabric for military uniforms, which was their first government contract. During World War I remember an express train was filled with yarn and shipped to the American Red Cross in Chicago for the war effort. Okay, so then they would distribute that yarn to ladies at homes and would knit socks and so on. In anticipation of war in 1940, Horner Woolens received an order from the United States Army for 47 million pounds of wool. That's just a lot. The Army ordered 550,000 blankets at a cost of over $3 million, which in today's dollars would be $67 million. Horner Woolens was providing a lot of employment for Eaton Rapids residents. During the war years, the mill concentrated their production on fabrics, blankets, and yarn. And for many years, one of their principal products of the mill was automobile upholstery cloth. My father used to joke that every country in the world where cars were driven had a little bit of Eaton Rapids in it. The Horner family was also proud that their hospital blankets were known as the finest. And before the polio vaccine was introduced, the mill manufactured polio cloth. And that was felted wool that was soaked in water and then applied to the legs of polio patients. And wool, when it's wet, gives off just a little bit of heat, and I think that must have been, you know, the healing properties of that polio cloth. Another proud moment in the Horner Woolen mill history was when the luxurious ocean liner, the USS United States, contracted for passenger blankets and steamer robes on its maiden voyage in 1952. Horner Woolen Mill hit its peak during World War II, primarily because England was not able to produce the wool it needed due to the war. My father died in 1960, and he knew then that the woolen mill was in decline due to the development of synthetic fabrics. We had already started to wind down the business by 1955, with only a skeleton crew in the mill. Retail stores around the state remained until the early 1960s, and the retail store in Eaton Rapids offered 5 woolen blankets and a variety of wool articles until the late 1970s. So, and some of you may know more history than that on up, but just a proud, starting from not very much to a really great mill. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, folks. Most of you know me, W. Scott Munn. Most of you know me because I wrote this book, The Only Eaton Rapids on Earth. But frankly, history was one of my last loves. My first love was music. And I was pretty much self-taught. I took after my father, Asa, who was a gifted musician. Now, I was born in Illinois in 1871. My folks returned to the Eaton Rapids area 2 years later. You see, Asa was born in Hamlin Township. I loved music, and at the time, Eaton Rapids had a band called the Maynard Band, named after its conductor and manager, Horace Maynard. Now, I wanted to march with the band, but when you're only 7 years old and only this tall, you can't keep up with the adults, but I tried mightily. 2 years later, Mr. Maynard had the cymbal player quit, and my father said, you know, Scott, why don't you try out for the band? And I became a member at 9 years old, playing the cymbals. Now the bands back then competed in drill and musicianship, and the band was going to Detroit, but Mr. Maynard wouldn't take me. He thought I was too small. And I followed them all the way when they marched from the hall to the train, crying mightily. And my mother was trying to console me, and the way she consoled me was to make me my own band uniform. So I had a very good uniform, gold braid, my hat with a big coxcomb coming out the top. And I very proudly marched with the band. I loved to march next to my dad, who was 6'6", and he was the drum major. So you can imagine, with a big hat and the feather on top, how tall he was. I got to be about 14 years old, and Director Maynard said, I need somebody to play the bass drum. So I volunteered. But at 14, I was still a slip of a lad, and the drum, when I held it, almost dragged on the ground. Now, the thing is, they got their money's worth out of me, you see, because I played the drum and the cymbals and marched at the same time. You know how you do that? You take one cymbal, you mount it on the top of the bass drum, you take the other cymbal in your left hand, play the cymbals, hit the drum with your right hand, which works great. Now, we marched and performed for just about anything that went on locally. The Grand Army of the Republic had an encampment in Diamondale, and it was in a rather rough field. And I was marching across the field, and I tripped and fell on my face. and I couldn't get up because I was straddling over the drum. A few years later, when I turned 18, then Horace Maynard, well, he became a judge, and so he retired as the conductor, and I became the conductor of the band, a position I held until my death in 1952. In 1919, the men in the band thought I did such a good job, they unanimously voted that it be called Munn's Band. We marched all over and performed all over the state. During the summer, there would be concerts in Island Park. In 1933, well, the building that housed our music library and some of our instruments burned down. But the town loved us so much, we were able to do a popular subscription and got new band uniforms. Oh, I forgot to mention, when it comes to name dropping, I was on first name basis with the conductor of the U.S. Marine Band, John Philip Sousa. You know, I spent just about my entire life in Eaton Rapids. About the same time I took over the band, I started working for the post office here in Eaton Rapids. And I worked for the U.S. government as a civil service servant for 52 years. The thing I'm most proud of as a post office worker was in 1913, the town was going to get free delivery to everybody's home. But the city needed somebody to go through the whole town and make sure everybody had an address on their house and there were no duplicate street names. So Eaton Rapids hired me to do that. The city commission liked my work so much, they named a street after me, Munn Street. It runs between 5 Point and Vaughan. It's only a couple blocks long. Now, you've probably heard that I've written this book. My love of history comes from being in this town for so long and knowing the earliest settlers. And at one point, I was asked by the folks at Horner Woolen Mills to write or make a map of all the mineral springs in town, which I did, and Horner Mills liked it so much, particularly because one of the springs was on their property, that they published a map. In 1941, I retired from the post office after 52 years. I served several terms on the commission. And then, guess what? Mr. Torquay and Mr. Kloppel with the mill drafted me to write a history of Eaton Rapids. And I said, I'm too old. I can't be drafted. And they said, yes, you can. And so I sat down, and it took a while to write the history of Eaton Rapids and Hamlin and Eaton Rapids Township. Now, I had a lot more material in that. I wrote everything out by longhand. And there was a committee that helped me put the book together, somebody to type it, somebody to edit it, somebody to find the publisher, and somebody to do the illustrations. I finished the book in early 1952, and I died December 13th of 1952. In my plot here, you will see my mother and father's graves, and also the grave of my sister Lena, who is 7 years younger than me. My wife Bertha is buried over in Section B. I married relatively late in life. I was 54 years old. Bertha was 47. We had no children. Now, I would like to leave you with this last parting thought. It's the end of my book. Life is the most pleasant thing of all, discharging our duties day to day. So when the final summons comes, they'll remember you passed this way. Thank you for coming.
So that's going to do it for today's journey through history. This was a cemetery tour at Rosehill Cemetery in Eaton Rapids, Michigan, and it was organized by the Eaton County Historical Commission. They do a fabulous job, and all the money that they raise, any donations they receive throughout the year, go towards historic preservation in Eaton County. So if you would like to support the work that they're doing, I'm going to put the link in the description of this video with their website, and you can take a look at some of the books that they have and find out about their upcoming cemetery tours and events and support them. And until next time, when we take another journey together through history in whatever form it takes, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, please hit the like button down there, share the video with others, and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, thanks for watching.
Cool.